History likes to pretend kings ruled with iron wills and unshakable dignity. But sometimes entire kingdoms turned on something far more fragile, a wounded ego behind a locked bedroom door. In Tudor England, two young women stepped into Henry VIII world believing they were marrying a king. They would discover they were marrying a storm, one whose fury could rewrite laws, destroy ministers, and decide who lived and who died. This is not just a story of queens. It is a story of pride, fear, vanity, and the dangerously thin line between royal desire and royal rage. What if the fate of England shifted because a king could not face the truth about his own body? In January 1540, Henry VIII stormed into a room in Rochester, tearing off his disguise after a first meeting that left him humiliated to the core. His new bride, Anne of Cleves, had not recognized him. Worse, she recoiled when he kissed her. For a man who believed every woman should melt at his touch, that small moment became an unforgivable insult. Within 6 months, their marriage would vanish from the record as if it had never happened, and the man who arranged it, Thomas Cromwell, would lose his head for it. Anne of Cleves had no idea she was walking into a trap woven from politics and vanity. On New Year's Day, she stood at a window watching bull baiting when 7 cloaked riders approached. Among them was Henry himself, heavy-set, limping from an ulcerated leg, and convinced he was reenacting a knightly romance. He wanted Anne to see through his disguise and recognize her destined king. Instead, she treated him like any polite stranger. She thanked him, turned back to the dogs in the courtyard, and unknowingly shattered Henry's fantasy of irresistible charm. By the time Henry returned in full royal splendor and realized her mistake, but the wound was already too deep. On the barge back to Greenwich, he spat bitterly to Sir Anthony Browne that she was nothing like he'd been promised. That single complaint set the clock ticking. The wedding was 4 days away. Someone would pay for Henry's embarrassment. Their wedding night sealed Anne's fate. In the privacy of the bedchamber, nothing happened. The king later gave crude explanations to his closest advisors. He found her body repellent. He said, her smell unpleasant, her figure unappealing. But the truth was far more dangerous to his pride. Henry needed to prove the marriage was unconsummated without admitting impotence. So he crafted a narrative. He tried, he insisted, but she was too unattractive for him to be stirred. Yet he boasted of nocturnal emissions to prove his virility. It was a performance meant to protect a throne built on masculine image. For 6 months, the farce continued. And, raised in a conservative German household, barely understood what consummation meant. When asked later if the marriage had been completed, she thought sharing a bed and a kiss might have been enough. Meanwhile, Henry's circle, Sir Anthony Denny, Thomas Cromwell, and others, watched the king simmer in frustration. By summer, the papers were ready, the witnesses primed, and Cromwell's death warrant was practically written. In July 1540, Henry's council assembled to dismantle the marriage. Bishop Gardiner and Thomas riotously crafted a legal weapon disguised as an inquiry, and never appeared. She never testified. Instead, officials declared that a vague childhood marriage arrangement counted as a pre-contract. They repeated every insult Henry had made about her body. They claimed Henry never consented in his heart. Within days, the marriage was erased and received the news at Richmond Palace. She had one choice: resist and risk execution, or yield and live. She chose life with a clarity that would make her the most successful survivor among Henry's wives. She accepted the annulment, praised Henry's kindness, and stepped quietly into the role of the king's beloved sister, earning wealth, estates, and independence no other wife enjoyed. She outlived them all but Catherine Parr. But Cromwell, the mastermind of Henry's Reformation, had no such path of escape. The Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Gardiner had waited years to destroy him. The Anne of Cleves fiasco gave them the opening. They whispered that Cromwell had deceived Henry, tricked him into a shameful marriage. On June 10th, Cromwell was arrested during a council meeting, dragged to the Tower, and condemned without trial. His final days were spent signing statements that supported Henry's narrative, hoping service might save him. It did not. On July 28, 1540, he died on Tower Hill. At the same moment, Henry married a new bride, a teenager named Catherine Howard. Catherine Howard, unlike Anne, walked into the marriage holding a secret that would kill her. Raised in the chaotic Norfolk household, she grew up in a dormitory where young noble women were unsupervised, vulnerable, and often exploited. At 13, Catherine had already experienced furtive touches and whispered encounters in the dark. Men like Henry VIII and later Francis Dereham marked her early years with forbidden intimacy, a past she prayed the king would never hear. But in Henry's England, a queen's body was not her own. It was evidence, property, and ultimately potential treason. When whispers of Catherine's past, and later her affair with Thomas Culpeper, reached the council, Parliament created a brand new law just to kill her. At 20 years old, she followed in Bullen to the scaffold. 2 women, 2 bedrooms, 2 disasters that reshaped Tudor England. But the truth teachers never told you is this. The real crisis was not their beauty, their virtue, or their mistakes. It was Henry himself, a king terrified of weakness, desperate to prove virility, and willing to spill blood rather than face the truth hiding behind his own closed doors. History often hides its most brutal truths behind coronations and royal portraits, but sometimes a kingdom pivots not on a battlefield, not in a council chamber, but in the silent humiliation of a single bedroom. In the winter of 1540, the fragile pride of Henry VIII would set England on a path paved with annulments, executions, and a queen who practiced her own beheading the night before she died. This is the intertwined fate of 2 women, one who survived by yielding, and one who died because she once knew desire before a king. It began in Rochester on New Year's Day, 1540. Anne of Cleves stood at a window, watching a bull baiting, unaware her future was minutes from collapsing. 7 cloaked riders approached. Among them was Henry VIII himself, disguised, limping from ulcers that never healed, and clinging to a chivalric fantasy that true love would recognize him instantly. And did not. When he kissed her, she politely thanked the stranger and returned her gaze to the courtyard. For a king who believed women should tremble under his touch, it was a humiliation sharper than any blade. By the time he reappeared in royal velvet and realized her error, but a wound inflicted on a king's vanity seldom closes. On the barge back to Greenwich, Henry declared she was nothing like the portrait Cromwell had promised. That single comment would condemn the king's most powerful minister. The wedding, however, proceeded. And on the wedding night, nothing happened. Henry later claimed her body revolted him, her smell, her looseness, her appearance. Yet behind the crude language was something far more dangerous. He could not risk being seen as impotent. So he insisted he could perform with others, just not with her. It was a narrative designed to protect his image. For 6 months, the charade endured, and, raised in the sheltered German court, barely understood consummation. She even believed a kiss and shared bed might cause pregnancy. Meanwhile, Henry's attendants watched the king seethe. By July, the machinery was turning. Cromwell was arrested, condemned without trial, and on July 28th, the same day Henry married a new bride, the executioner hacked at his neck until the job was done, and, however, chose survival. Presented with the annulment, she accepted instantly, calling Henry's treatment clean and pure. In return, she received riches, estates, and a comfortable future as the king's beloved sister. She outlived nearly everyone, but the girl who replaced her, Catherine Howard, would not. Catherine's story began years earlier in the chaotic dormitory of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Dozens of young noble women slept together in the maiden's chamber, largely unsupervised. It was here, at 13, that Catherine learned what men desired. Henry VIII touched her during music lessons. Later, Francis Dereham arrived, older, charming, and determined to claim her. He stole the keys to the dormitory, brought wine and food from midnight banquets, and crawled into her bed. Catherine later confessed he used her as his wife many and sundry times. They exchanged gifts and even called each other husband and wife. Those nights were whispered away, buried in the past. But past and Tudor England had long shadows. By 1539, the Duke of Norfolk needed leverage at court. Cromwell's Protestant influence threatened the Howard family. Norfolk saw an opportunity in his niece, 17, graceful, lively Catherine Howard. He placed her as lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, situating her directly where Henry would notice her. And he did. The king, now obese, diseased, and exhausted by pain, saw Catherine dancing and felt desire flicker back to life. Soon he was giving her jewels and writing her letters in his own hand, something he rarely did anymore. The annulment of Anne's marriage was finalized on July 9, 1540. 19 days later, while Cromwell's severed head cooled on the scaffold, Henry married Catherine Howard. He called her his rose without a thorn. He believed he had found innocence. He had not. Catherine's past, Manox's touching, Derham's bed, had been carefully hidden. But secrecy is fragile, and Catherine, trapped in the golden cage of queenship, reached again for affection. This time, the object was Thomas Culpeper, young, handsome, dangerous, and a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. With the help of Lady Jane Rochford, they met in locked rooms, back staircases, and even a public latrine during the Northern Progress. Catherine wrote him letters signed, "Yours as long as life endures." Culpeper confessed she once told him, "If the king were dead, I would marry you." That single sentence was treason. On All Saints' Day, 1541, while Henry prayed blissfully unaware, Archbishop Cranmer received a letter from Mary Lascelles, a woman who had witnessed Catherine's youthful indiscretions. Cranmer dared not speak the accusations aloud. Instead, he placed the letter on the king's seat in the chapel. Henry read it alone. He ordered an investigation, convinced his beloved wife would be exonerated. Instead, Manox confessed everything. Derham admitted even more. When Cranmer confronted Catherine, she collapsed into hysterics, unable to deny what had happened. Culpeper's letters sealed her fate. Henry, the man who had stood firm against popes and rebels, wept publicly. His grief was said to be so violent that even ambassadors pitied him. But humiliation hardens quickly into rage. Catherine was stripped of her title in November. Parliament was summoned not to judge her, but to kill her legally. In January 1542, a new law was crafted specifically to execute her. It declared that any woman who concealed unchaste behavior before marrying the king had committed treason. It was retroactive. It named Catherine directly. No trial, no defense. Her fate was sealed by ink. Derham and Culpeper were executed first. Their heads were placed on spikes above London Bridge. On February 10th, guards came for Catherine at Sine Abbey. She screamed and fought as they dragged her to the barge. Passing under London Bridge, she would have seen the rotting heads of the men who once loved her. She was taken to the same rooms Bullen had occupied before her execution. On February 11th, the Attainder Act received royal assent. She had 3 days left. Legend says she requested the execution block be brought to her chamber so she could practice placing her neck upon it, terrified of a clumsy stroke. On the final night, Jane Rochford was placed in the chamber beside her. Both women would die together. At dawn on February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard, once the king's bright, adored rose, stepped onto the scaffold at the Tower of London. She was 19 years old. Her last words were a soft plea for mercy. And when the axe fell, it ended not only her life, but a chapter of England shaped entirely by one man's pride, fears, and desires behind a closed bedroom door. February 13th, 1542. Tower Green. The sun had barely begun to wrestle its way through the winter mist when guards came for Catherine Howard. At 19, perhaps 20, no one bothered recording the birth date of an impoverished noble girl. She was being led to the private execution ground reserved for queens. Not the jeering crowds of Tower Hill, not the grotesque theatrics of Tyburn. This was a controlled ritual, witnessed only by council members and officials trusted to repeat the king's preferred version of events. She could hardly stand. Her legs trembled so violently that 2 guards held her upright as she climbed the scaffold. Waiting for her was the French executioner, the same man who had beheaded Thomas Cromwell 2 years earlier. He was chosen for one reason: precision. Catherine had spent the previous night rehearsing this moment, kneeling before a wooden block, practicing the angle of her neck so the blade would strike true. But now, standing before the real thing, stained with the blood of Anne Boleyn and others who had met their end here, all that practice felt like nothing. Her final words were quiet, almost fragile. She acknowledged her sins. Some later wrote she claimed she deserved 100 deaths. Whether she believed this or was performing the script expected of a disgraced queen, no one could say. She asked those gathered to pray for her soul and for mercy on her family. Then she knelt. She placed her neck upon the block, just as she had practiced. The axe dropped in a single clean stroke. The girl once called the king's rose without a thorn bled into the straw. Immediately afterward, Jane Rochford was brought forward. Older, about 37, and nearly broken by imprisonment, some wondered whether she even understood where she was. But when she spoke, her mind was painfully clear. She confessed her part, called herself the chief cause of the queen's ruin, admitted arranging the secret meetings that doomed them both. Moments later, she too knelt, and the blade fell again. Their bodies were wrapped in linen and carried to St. Peter ad Vincula, the tower's small chapel. They were buried in unmarked graves beside Anne Boleyn, their bones mingling beneath the chapel floor. 3 of Henry VIII's 6 wives would one day lie there, casualties of a king who destroyed women when they failed to fit his vision of perfection. Outside the tower walls, London carried on. Markets opened. Children chased each other in the streets. Bakeries sent warm bread steaming into the cold air. And at Hampton Court, Henry VIII, mourning in public, already restless in private, began contemplating his next wife. Catherine Howard's execution was finished. The court had moved on, but a quieter question flickered through Tudor corridors, whispered by those careful enough to keep their voices low. What if the real problem had never been the queen's? For years, hints had been gathering like dust in a forgotten corner. During Anne Boleyn's 1536 trial, one charge, whispered by enemies and repeated by servants, was that she mocked the king's performance in bed. She had allegedly told her ladies that Henry was impotent, that he could no longer act as a husband ought. Those words helped send her to the scaffold, but they also pointed to something physicians and modern scholars recognize today. Then came the Anne of Cleves disaster. Henry's own testimony, insisting that though he had wet dreams, he could not consummate the marriage, revealed more than he intended. A confident man does not need to swear his masculinity through nocturnal emissions. Henry was confessing, unknowingly, that something was wrong. His doctors already knew. Dr. William Butts had tended the king's festering leg ulcers for years. The wounds oozed constantly, required daily dressing, and were sometimes burned with hot irons to cauterize infected flesh. Chronic pain, infection, and the massive strain on Henry's body would have severely lowered testosterone, diminished sexual function, and eroded any physical capacity for intimacy. By 1540, Henry weighed over 300 pounds. His waist measured 54 inches. He could barely walk. His armor had to be fitted with mechanical pulleys just to hoist him onto a horse. The once golden Prince of England was now the man imprisoned by his own body. But the clearest evidence came from his wives' reproductive histories. Catherine of Aragon had 6 pregnancies with Henry. Only one child survived. Modern researchers now believe their losses may be linked to Henry's own genetic markers, such as antigen incompatibility, a condition that affects fetal survival when carried by the father. And Boleyn miscarried multiple times. Jane Seymour birthed a son, Edward, but died 12 days later. Catherine Howard never conceived during her 16 months as queen, despite Henry's insistence that they had a vigorous marriage. Anne of Cleves lived 17 peaceful years after Henry. She never remarried, but never had children, perhaps because the marriage truly was never consummated. All signs point in one direction. Henry VIII was likely the source of his marital failures, physically and genetically. Yet instead of confronting this truth, he projected it outward onto women who could not challenge him. He executed Anne Boleyn for adultery, to explain away miscarriages. He declared Anne of Cleves repulsive to justify impotent knights. He killed Catherine Howard for a sexual past that threatened his ego. And he shattered Catherine of Aragon's life because she could not bear a healthy son. His refusal to accept responsibility reshaped Europe. When the Pope denied Henry's annulment from Catherine of Aragon, the king, furious that Rome would not bend to his will, severed England from the Catholic Church entirely. Thomas Cromwell and Archbishop Cranmer crafted the laws that made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth seized, their land redistributed. Centuries of religious life were wiped away because Henry needed an heir and refused to admit the problem might be him. Diplomatically, the cost was enormous. England lost its alliance with Spain. The Holy Roman Emperor considered invasion. Protestant German princes hesitated to trust a king whose marriage alliances crumbled as quickly as his temper. The collapse of the Anne of Cleves marriage destroyed Cromwell and undermined England's last chance at a powerful Protestant coalition. The execution of Catherine Howard humiliated the conservative faction that had pushed her forward. Henry's personal life became a diplomatic nightmare. And all of it, every execution, every shift in foreign policy, every religious upheaval, traced back to a king whose body was failing. In 1537, Jane Seymour finally delivered the long-awaited son, Edward. Henry had spent years tearing down the fabric of English society in pursuit of this child. But Edward would reign for only 6 years before dying at 15. His early death plunged the kingdom into a succession crisis that sent Lady Jane Grey to the block, drenched Mary Tudor's reign in flames, and forced Elizabeth I to navigate decades of plots and invasions, all rooted in Henry's desperate quest for a male heir. When the Tudor line finally collapsed in 1603 with Elizabeth's death, the crown passed not to Henry's descendants, but to the Scottish Stuarts, the line he had tried so hard to push aside. And through it all, Anne of Cleves, the woman he'd rejected with insults, lived quietly and contentedly. She attended Elizabeth's coronation. She managed her estates with dignity. She died peacefully in 1557, surrounded by attendants who respected her. She survived Henry because she understood what the others never fully grasped. Never confront a king with the truth he fears most. Catherine Howard could not play that game, and Boleyn would not. Catherine of Aragon refused. Jane Seymour died. Catherine Parr escaped only by luck. But Anne of Cleves, by accepting humiliation, by bowing to the lie rather than resisting it, outlived the entire Tudor storm. The bedroom battles that shaped England were not lost by the queens. They were lost by a king too proud, too insecure, and too broken to admit he was the problem all along.